back. WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively into the championship week around here, and we're going to be doing the Maryland Crab Cake Tour over in Catonsville this weekend with our friends at State Fair. You can find all that information out at baltimorepositive.com. Of course, all brought to you by the Maryland Lottery in conjunction with our friends at Window Nation, 866-90Nation. And you buy two, you get two free, and you get 5 years, 0% financing. But you don't get to see into the windows of the souls of the Buffalo Bills fans, of the Dallas Cowboys fans, of these poor fans that made it all the way to the division weekend, home games, snow globe in Buffalo. Luke, what the hell happened to the Bills over the weekend? I thought they were winning the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think of all the results from the divisional round, that easily is the most surprising. Not that I thought the Bengals couldn't win. We're talking about a team that went to the Super Bowl last year. Here in Baltimore and in Pittsburgh, there needs to be an acknowledgement. There's a new kid in town as far as running the AFC North the last couple of years. It is what it is.
Same
However,
uniforms, different hearts.
It is. It is. Whether you like them or not, and there's plenty of trash talk, and they're brash and bold, and in some ways, kind of reminds you of the old Ravens in terms of how they do a lot of talking, but they've backed it up. And going back to what I was just saying, the idea that Buffalo could lose to Cincinnati wasn't shocking, but considering the elements, considering they were playing at home, what they look like? They kind of look like what the Miami Dolphins typically look like going to Buffalo, playing in the cold and the snow. Like they didn't look like they really wanted to be there. And clearly they wanted to win, but boy, a lot of missed tackles. They got beat up at the line of scrimmage on both sides
pushed
of the
around.
ball. Cincinnati
really
dominated them. They really did. It was 27-10, and that's not a blowout in the way that the Eagles blew out the Giants on Saturday night. But they controlled the game from start to finish. It was a couple points that looked like Buffalo had a chance to swing the momentum a little bit, but Cincinnati they took it to them, and I think what we talked about at this time last year is holding true again. That Bengals defense, while it doesn't blow you away statistically, at least in the regular season, they've stepped up. Look at how they played. Look at how they limited that Buffalo offense. So you have to give them a lot of credit. And Joe Burrow going on the road, winning another playoff game. So impressive. Really impressive. Again, if you tell me the Bengals beat the Bills, I'm not batting an eyelash over that. The Bengals were playing great football. Look at the long winning streak they had to close the regular season, but to do it in the fashion in which they did it so convincingly, that was impressive. That was, again, the Eagles had the biggest margin of victory of the weekend, and they dominated the Giants, but to do that on the road against Buffalo, considering the backdrop of DeMar Hamlin's there, everything they've gone through. The script was there, right, for Buffalo to be the team of destiny, and the Bengals squashed that idea very quickly on Sunday afternoon. So you have to give them credit. They go to Kansas City now, and they've beaten the Chiefs 3 times in a row. So,
and they don't care where they play. They just played on the North Pole. Literally,
yeah.
Right? Like once you go to the North Pole and you play like that and you throw the ball, he threw the ball 31 times in the first half in the snow.
Yeah. They made plays. Chase almost had the other touchdown that was overturned. What would have been a phenomenal play, but they made plays. 23-36, 242 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's bad weather quarterbacking right there. Where you just say, I don't care what the elements are. I'm just going to go out there and make plays. And I've got great receivers, in Chase, and Hayden Hurst had a big game for them at the tight end position. So they went out and did it, and they ran the football too. That's the element. We talked about this early in the season when the Ravens played them in week 5, that Sunday night game. What was one of the biggest issues for Cincinnati early in the season? Lots of talk about the 2 high looks they were having issues with, that the Ravens still gave them some problems with at the end of the season, but they weren't running the football. Well, they ran the ball. They ran the ball a lot on Sunday. So you have to give them credit. And,
if your backup offensive line isn't great, but they can still road grade a little bit, and you can move the ball forward, and you can get a couple of first downs. You don't even need to score points or kick just to be able to prove you can move the ball a little bit. They got 3/5 of their offensive line out. and they went out there and dominated. Now we talked about Von Miller a little bit in the broadcast, and the differences of
Right.
the Bills from this Sunday versus the Bills we saw 13, 14 weeks ago, right? It was a long time ago that the Ravens played the Bills. That the difference makers the skill position players still shine if you give them a second. Just give them a second, right? I mean, and the backup offensive line doing that. I mean, I stand and applaud what the Bengals are doing. And I tell you what, you love football. I love football. We've loved football all our lives. You know, Bengals at Chiefs this week. That's a good game. This is something to be looking forward to on Sunday afternoon.
No question about it. I mean, look what they did in the AFC Championship last year. I mean, that was a really good football game. And I mean, Cincinnati was behind in that game, and you're thinking, okay, well, Mahomes and the Chiefs back in the Super Bowl. No surprise there. And
They were
the
still
Beng
wearing Bengals jerseys last year. I watched that game at the Chaucer with my wife. I remember that because I was going to the Super Bowl and sort of, who's going to be there and all that. And I'm like, the Bengals aren't allowed to go to the Super Bowl. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like there was a feeling about that. Whatever stigma you have about the Brown family or Marvin or Ken Anderson or Boomer Esiason or Booby Clark, whatever, Chris Collinsworth, take it all the way back, right? This is it's not your father's Bengals. I mean, they're winning games here now that really good teams do, and it snowed in January in Buffalo, and Buffalo was the best team. This is the dream scenario in Buffalo, right? Like we're going to get them up here on our terms. That's everyone's fear is going to Buffalo in a snowstorm in January and having to play a team that has fundamentally been better than most of the other teams. Kansas City aside, the rest of the year. I mean, demoralizing does it begin to express my thoughts if I'm from Western New York right now. I mean, it's
yeah,
it's really disappointing for Bills fans, I think specifically, and I guess the other side is the Bengals fans have been waiting forever. It makes me sort of root for the Bengals a little bit in some sort of strange way to like get this done, get it out of their system because we're gonna have to deal with them. And this Joe Burrow thing we're seeing now, it does make me wonder what they're thinking in Owings Mills in regard to we have to deal with this.
yeah. I mean, the entire division. Pittsburgh's having the same conversations right now. I mean, Joe Burrow has changed everything for the Bengals, and they have other good players. Let's be clear about that. But you have a guy like Joe Burrow. I mean, you've got a chance every single week, every single year. He recently said it. He doesn't view them as their window being wide open. He says his window is his entire career, and some people will love that, some people hate that kind of talk. But I mean, he's bold. He backs it up. He's won a national championship at the collegiate level, and he's a win away from going to back-to-back Super Bowls. So it's tough in that
And he
way.
even played defense last year against the Rams.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, that Cincinnati defense has been, they've risen to the occasion in the postseason, and I get it. They lost to the Rams. It's not like they got blown out in the Super Bowl. It was a close game, one score
Yeah, I
game.
think that's given them a little bit of hunger that I think you and I have seen when Billy Cundiff missed the field goal. And next thing you know, we're having a parade 53 weeks later, right?
Yeah, well, and what we've seen in recent years, however, is the Super Bowl hangover. No one's talking about that this year, right? I mean, everyone talks about the Super Bowl loser. How many times in recent years, go back the last 20 years, how often that team doesn't just fail to get back to the Super Bowl. A lot of times they don't even make the playoffs. And yet Cincinnati and guys like me who consider themselves really smart, but we're wrong all the time just because no one knows what's going to happen. By the way, I'm not very smart. That was a joke.
I
But
think you're smart, but
I appreciate that. But the thought was we kept looking at that second half of the Bengals schedule, right? We kept talking about that. Wow, it's a bear of a schedule. That's why I thought the Ravens were going to win the division before Lamar Jackson gets hurt. And go down the line of things that go down the list of things that Cincinnati looked like was going to be a problem for them, and they just kept winning, and they kept winning, and they kept winning. So, I mean, it's just really impressive on their part. But you said it. I mean, yeah, they miss Von Miller. There's no question about it for Buffalo, but boy, that was not a good performance in terms of an under the hood type deal. When you consider where they were last year, that classic divisional round battle they had with Kansas City, going back and forth, all the talk about overtime and changing the overtime rules and all that. I mean, it was set up for Buffalo to be that team to have their vengeance, right? To have their validation this year, so to
I
speak.
felt like it
And
was their year, long
yeah,
before DeMar Hamlin. I felt like they're credible. they've moved into that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think as it pertains to the AFC, and you know me, I'm a football nerd and looking at different analytics numbers. I mean, DVOA and EPA and all these different, football power index for ESPN. Go down the list of all the different metrics you can find. They've widely regarded Buffalo as the best team in the NFL. But I will say this, the eyeball test for the Bills later in the season, it hadn't looked as good. It hadn't looked as dominant as it had looked early in the season. Now that didn't mean that they weren't going to win or make a run, but it was early on in the season where you looked at them and just said, "Wow, I mean they look kind of sort of unbeatable overall." But they didn't look quite as dominant there, and you can talk about Von Miller a lot, and I think that was a huge factor, no question. But what we saw on Sunday, that went beyond Von Miller. I mean, that was a game to me that wasn't impressed with what the Bills had under the hood, quite frankly. I mean, they were not very tough. Again, they look like a warm weather team coming to that environment and not wanting to be there, right? I mean, they look like a team that was kind of miserable in that way. But I think the interesting thing,
Burrow
as we
looked a little bit like Jack Torrance at the end of The Shining a couple of times. He kind of had the permagrin going on from the cold. I mean, Burrow looked like he was hurting at the end, like literally. So did Josh Allen. He was all bloody and like, I mean, that was one for the ages. You know what I mean? I've sat out in the snow at playoff games. I've gone to 100 playoff games on the road in good weather, bad weather. That was kind of an all-timer because those were two. Not that Kansas City might not be the best team, and they may prove that at home next week, but I felt like this was heavyweights. Luke, you and I talked about this after the DeMar Hamlin injury. That was a Monday night game that, like, I thought was the game of the year, kind of.
right,
We had special food. We had a bottle of wine picked. We were into that game, and then it stopped. And obviously, all that
sure.
happened, that rematch, boy, it's like I guess Ali Frazier. You look at all of them and say, where are they on the spectrum? Boy, this is one where the Bills and the Stephon Diggs thing, right? I mean, I know he had Turp and all, but not a good look in the. I mean, it feels like we have our own problems here with our quarterback and flying press conference. We have our own issues here. But up in Buffalo, when this kind of disappointment happens, and you mention what happens after you get beat, Cincinnati bird up, and here they are. Bills are building a stadium, and don't tell anybody, they're the only thing that matters in West. I mean, they're a really big deal there in every household, and the drama in the aftermath of this could eat them up a little bit.
Well, I mean, you have that, and you just have the factor of they have paid their quarterback. We know that once a quarterback is making that elite top shelf kind of money, not that you're done or anything like that, but we know that roster building becomes more and more challenging as time goes on. I mean, they gave Josh Allen his contract in August of 2021, and now, those cap numbers are, they you have to account for that. That doesn't mean you can't still have a really good team, but it does become more challenging. That's why Cincinnati right now, yeah, the message there has to be, the urgency has to be there to do that right now. Not that they're not going to re-sign Joe Burrow or anything like that, but we know how this works
Well, I
everywhere.
love the announcers are all like, "Oh, Burrow to Chase. This is going to be a thing for." Well, I don't know. I mean, we're
Maybe
going to have a $61 million quarterback because that's where it's going to be, and then you're going to have a $38 million wide receiver. And they're both going to be 28, not 23. Like, you better win. I'm
right.
with you, dude, because it sounds like it's together for a long time. And hey, as Ed Reed turns down the Bethune-Cookman thing, and I think about Reed, Lewis, Suggs, how they kept it together here, how they only had two coaches here, how they only had one general manager here. This is where the Duke Tobins and the Mike Browns and the Brown family and the Bengals and whatever the Bills are going to be with the Pagulas, they haven't won anything. I mean, what have they proven, right? As an ownership group and how to hold this thing together and hold players together. I mean, the Rams are a great example. You talk about the hangover going the other way. I mean, it falls apart quickly, and we might be finding that out in 5.5 weeks here when Lamar's wearing a Dolphins helmet and we've got draft picks all of a sudden, right? And cap space.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how that's going to play out, but that's why I said at the time of when they lost to Tennessee in January of 2020, people, and I understood
You were
Ravens
really
fans were
mopey that day because you
Ravens
You thought
Well,
we might be 3 years here and not get back, literally,
I mean,
right?
that's the thing, and I understood why people said it at the time because everyone was so devastated. I mean, that was as disappointing of a playoff loss, and people will say Billy Cundiff, but yeah, that was right there at the AFC Championship. For me, that felt so much like Ravens Indy 2006. I mean, a team that was great in the regular season, and it's so easy just to try to tell yourself because you're bummed, right? It's so easy to tell yourself, well, they'll be back. They were a year ahead of schedule. And we're hearing the same kind of things about the Orioles right now with the rebuild. And well, they might have been a year ahead. They're not ready to spend.
Well,
And
hold on. Every team this weekend that lost, Jacksonville, the Giants, right? Maybe the Cowboys. I mean, they got 30 more years to wait as far as I'm concerned. But these teams that have a young quarterback that, I don't know if you believe in Daniel, my brother, or not, but certainly you believe in Trevor Lawrence, right? So for these losing teams, their fan base, I mean, the Jaguars fan base is, hey, we're on to something. Let's buy some tickets. Let's buy some hope. Let's buy a piece of that. That was easy to sell 3 years ago when we had a 22-year-old MVP quarterback that
yeah,
spit up and San Diego, or were they? No, they were in. No, they were in LA. They were the Chargers.
yeah,
Like when they came in and beat you the first time, but the Titans thing getting run over, that was we need to build our defense now, right? So it always the pendulum swings back and forth for how we got beaten. To your point with the Bills, they got beaten
yeah.
across the board, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the overall point is nothing's guaranteed. And this is why when you talk about rebuilding, like I mentioned the Orioles, just in passing, I don't want to change the topic, but we always think of this process as being linear, right? Like it's some gradual progression. All right, you're going to win 9 games this year, and then it's going to be 10 next year, and then it's going to be 12 the following, and hey, we're going to win a Super Bowl after that. I mean, it's
It's
not how
not
it works.
algebra two.
I mean, think about it. I mean, the Ravens know this better than anyone. In 2000, I mean, they hadn't even had a winning season. They hadn't been to the playoffs, right? I mean, they benched their quarterback halfway through the season, and they
Billick
went
wouldn't let
five.
him say the word. Let's get that
Right,
out for the kids.
they went 5 straight games without scoring a touchdown. I mean, all these different things, and then boom, they won the Super Bowl. And the following year, Jamal Lewis tears his ACL first day or first week of training camp, and they had let some guys go because they tried to keep the band together for one more run, and that's fine. But we saw how that played out. They made it into the playoffs. They won one game and then got their feelings hurt in Pittsburgh. I mean, that this can be so fleeting. I mean, you mentioned Jacksonville. How about the fact that 5 years ago Jacksonville got to the AFC Championship with Blake Bortles? At the time, there was probably a lot of excitement about where they were going. Well, it was a one-time thing, and that's not to say that Trevor Lawrence is going to repeat that. I think a lot of Trevor Lawrence, but you don't know how this is going to go, and especially when you start talking about where the Bills are, where the Ravens are, even Kansas City. Patrick Mahomes. I mean, even though they're probably going to have to be redoing his deal in the next year or two anyway, because he's underpaid relative to all the deals since then.
I'll
As
be
it
talking to
pertains
Lee
to
Steinberg about that at some point.
yeah, I mean they're going to have to tear that up. I mean, people were impressed by the total of the deal, but the average annual value, Mahomes is still underpaid. I mean, that's how good he is, even on a bum ankle on Saturday. But you have to take advantage because you just don't know how it's going to play out. And we've talked about this a lot with the Ravens, and we'll get into it. We'll have a discussion about what we heard at the season-ending press conference. But this can be so fleeting, and all it can take is a couple bad decisions, a couple injuries. I mean, in the Ravens case, and other teams that were impacted by COVID, and just how crazy that made that season. I mean, when the Ravens were coming back from their 14-2 and their loss to the Titans. But I mean, you have to take advantage, and that's where you give Cincinnati some credit here. As much as they have done plenty of chirping, to the point where I think it's turned off a lot of people in terms of them complaining about how the league handled, all these different scenarios and all the talk about a neutral site AFC Championship game. And to be clear, they had a point as far as some of their beef. I think they did, but when you consider how much public complaining they did, considering
I'll
the
tell you what, dude, if
circumstances,
they go out to Kansas City, kick their ass right now, they've done something to go on the road and do this and do it as the bad guys and do it
yeah,
with the cigars and do it with the we got screwed and we still won. How about that? What are you going to
yeah,
do to us next,
and I mean, but they need to feel the urgency because you mentioned it. They were talking about it on the broadcast, and what's going to happen with a Jesse Bates who played on the tag this year. What's going to happen with other free agents they have. At Joe Burrow, this offseason is the first time that they can potentially pay him. What are they going to do? How's that going to impact the rest of the market? That'll tie in with Lamar. That'll tie in with Justin Herbert. I mean, it becomes more difficult as you go on to try to keep it together. That's why for Buffalo, I mean, this had to be devastating. Not that they're going to fall apart, but you just don't know. This felt like to me their best chance. Their window wasn't going to be more open than it was this year for them. And for them to lay the egg that they did, credit Cincinnati. But boy, it's going to be a long offseason in Western New York. There's no question about that.
The chalk doesn't always hold up. Yeah, I love how we just did a 20-minute segment about the championship games and didn't even mention the championship games in Philadelphia. I love that. Luke can be reached at Baltimore. Luke, they will be playing a championship game in Philadelphia against a third-string quarterback. Not ideal, but certainly one of my mom's favorite words was Purdy. She'd say, "Oh, that's Purdy." So every time we see Brock Purdy, we think of my mom. So fly Niners, fly. I don't have a dog in the hunt, the Niners and the Eagles. Luke and I are going to be dissecting all things John Angelos, Orioles off season, spring training, Super Bowl coming up in 2 weeks in Arizona, and of course, all things Lamar Jackson and the Baltimore Ravens. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking football. Baltimore positive. We got Rebecca Hoffberger this week. We got Crab Cake Tour this week over at State Fair. We got a lot of things going on. Stick around with us. It's going to be a good winter here. We'll keep you warm at WNST and BaltimorePositive.com.